And as I say that word, I'm sure that your eyes would be tempted to roll into the back of your head for a moment. Like, why do we need to know anything about economic theory? And I'm going to say it like this, that even though you might not think that the Bible has anything to say about how we deal with the poor and the hungry and the needy, it does. And this is probably the first example in the Bible of anyone dealing with those who are starving. And in our country, we have all kinds of programs. Everything is driven by one word, quote unquote, and the word is compassion. I want to tell you that if you make your economic policy, if you base it on compassion, you will ruin people's lives. Just think about compassion. They want to have compassion for children because they think that they don't know if they're men or women, boys or girls. And so being compassionate, they offer them surgeries. Is that compassionate? Not at all. People who don't have a job and are not challenged to get on work, they sit at home and eat their bonbons and watch their soap operas. We want to have compassion on them, so we give them food stamps and food and everything else. Is that compassionate? It is not compassionate to them. People who are in other countries, they hear that if they come to the New World, to America, that they can receive everything they want and they all get on all these social programs. Is that compassion? You know, they come across the desert and many of them pay, I think they call them coyotes or various individuals to smuggle them into the land, and they die and they're raped and they're robbed and their families are destroyed as they try and get here, and they get here and they don't have a good life. Is that compassion? Not at all. And frankly, if you think of the leftists in our country today, everything they do, they use the excuse of compassion. And Joseph here today is not going to feed the Egyptians because of compassion. There's some other things that are going on, and I really think, even though I know that you're not a socialist, right? And thank the Lord that you've been trained. Had the church talked about these kind of issues over the years, we wouldn't have 50 or 55% of the young people graduating in the universities or even in high school thinking that socialism is better than an economic system like capitalism. So yes, the Bible has something to say about it, and yes, we're going to talk about it. And I think it's honoring to God and important. 13, Genesis 47:13. Now there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all of the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which they had bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's household. And so when money failed in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us bread." Notice what they want. They want to be given. They want handouts. "Give us bread, for why should we die in your presence? For the money has failed." And then Joseph said, "Give me your livestock, for I will give you bread for your livestock if the money is gone." And so they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for horses, the flocks, the cattle of the herds, and for the donkeys. And thus he fed them with bread in exchange for all of their livestock that year. And when that year ended, then they came to him the next year, and they said to him, "We will not hide from my lord that our money is gone. My lord has also our herds of livestock. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for bread, and we and our land will be servants of Pharaoh. Give us seed that we may live and not die, that the land may not be destroyed." Now, if you're going to take notes, or if you like to underline things, I want you to notice the difference between what they offered, what they suggested, and what Joseph does. Because they said, "Buy us and buy our land." Now look in verse 20 and see if Joseph does what they had offered. But then Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for every man of the Egyptians sold his field because of the famine was severe upon them. What did he do that they offered, and what did he not do? He did buy the land just as they offered to buy the land, but he did not buy them as slaves. And the reason I'm highlighting this so significantly is this is one of the not one of the biggest, but it is an often made charge against Joseph that he enslaved people. And so if he enslaved people, that he's not anyone we should look to. And you take an unbeliever, and if they're looking for a reason to not like the Bible, if they're looking for a reason to not have faith in God, they're going to look for examples like this and try and prove that the scriptures are ungodly. And so this is what they're going to say there. Well, Joseph enslaved people. He was a great white European slaver, right? Almost. He's as bad as you white people, right? I mean, that's almost what this is about here. But he didn't do that. And so he did not take up their offer, even though in a couple of verses it is going to say that he acquired the people. And the word to acquire doesn't necessarily mean to buy as a slave. It might mean to hire and put them into his service. 21. So Genesis 47:21. And as for the people, he moved them into cities from one end of the borders of Egypt to the other end. And he's doing this because it's a lot easier to pass out grain if you're, located nearby. Not a bad thing whatsoever. But only the land of the priests did he not buy, for the priests had rations allotted to them by Pharaoh, and they and their rations, which Pharaoh gave them, they did not sell their lands. And I would include Israel, by the way, that Israel also was given the best of the land by Pharaoh. And I don't think that the Israelites who were living in Egypt had to buy grain and sell their land like the Egyptians did. They were basically an extension of the life of Joseph. 23. And then Joseph said to the people, indeed, I have bought you and your land this day for Pharaoh. And again, there is more than one word in the Hebrew for buy. And this word can mean to acquire something, to engage something. And so when he says he's bought them, it doesn't mean that they're slaves. In fact, he basically set them free, I would say in some regard. Look, here is seed for you, that you shall sow the land, and it shall come to pass that in the harvest that you should give 1/5 to Pharaoh. Does anybody remember, by the way, how much did Joseph require in the 7 years of good time that they would give back to Pharaoh? So it's been 5-6 years ago when the famine was, or when the 7 good years were there. He required that they give this much. So it's the same principle, 20%, which isn't too bad in terms of a tax. And so here's what he does. 4/5 shall be your own as seed for the field and for your food, for those of your household, and food for your little ones. And so they said, you have saved our lives. Let us find favor in your sight and of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants. And Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt to this day that Pharaoh should have 1/5, except for the land of the priests, which did not become Pharaoh's. So there are some wonderful principles that we can learn from the text, and I want to bring out as many of them to you as I can. Before I do that, though, I always love it when I find unique archaeological discoveries. So there are always discoveries that we're finding. There are at least 2 different inscriptions found in Yemen, of all places, over by Saudi Arabia, in which Joseph is actually mentioned. And I'm going to read to you an account here by one person in Yemen. He said, we dwelled at ease in this castle a long tract of time, so like several years we were doing well, nor had we a desire but for the region lord of the vineyard. In other words, we desired the king. Hundreds of camels returned to us each and every day at evening, their eyes pleasant to behold, and in their resting places. So the camels went in and out, and they were quite healthy. And twice the number of our camels were our sheep, in beautifulness like white does, and also the slow-moving kind, which are ox. We dwelt in this castle 7 years of good life. So very fascinating that they're claiming they had 7 years of amazing abundance. And then he says, and how difficult for the memory it's described. Then came the years of barren and burnt up life. So there's an exact statement and identity of the time and what happened in terms of the famine. In another one, also in the same region, they found an inscription, and it's the words of a princess. And she says, I, Tajah, the daughter of Den-Sephar, I sent my steward to Joseph. Isn't that fascinating? Extra biblical truth. I sent my steward to Joseph, and when he delayed returning to me, I sent my handmaid. In other words, the steward didn't make it. And with the measure of silver I sent for him to bring me back flour. And so it goes on and tells more about the story. I won't read it for you all right now. The significance is it mentions the name of the person and the fact that even people in other countries outside of Canaan and outside of Egypt had to go down to Egypt itself to get food along the way. Let's talk about Joseph's policy for just a little bit here. That's what I promised you that I was going to do. The first thing that we notice is that Joseph, this is last week, frankly, Joseph was faithful to Pharaoh. You know, he was given a job. He was responsible to take care of the kingdom and watch over Pharaoh's interest, and he does that. You ought to make your boss money. That's what he does along the way. First thing he does in verse 14 is he gives them grain for money, right? So they give their money, and he gives them grain, and that goes well for a year. They've got another year at least to go, and then the second year they come, and he gives them grain for their livestock. And of course that makes sense too. And then the third year they come back, and because they don't have anything left anymore, no money, they don't have any livestock, then they sell themselves into the hands of Pharaoh and their lands. So it's money, and then it's livestock, and then it's land and labor. So rather than thinking that they were just enslaved, I think the passage is teaching that what they offered for food for the next 4 years was land and labor to Pharaoh so that they would have money. And a couple principles that we could learn, and then we'll go through it a little bit further. He doesn't accept their offer. I'm really convinced of this. He does not accept their offer for them to become Pharaoh's slaves. He hires them, he acquires them to work for him, but notice what he does. Rather than making them slaves, he gives them all of the provision they need to plant. And it also says that he gave them enough to feed their families, and he gave them enough for all the food that they needed. And the only requirement for them is that they would, plant it, and they would give back 1/5 of it back to Pharaoh along the way. So, in fact, if you had a slave, would you give him all kinds of seed and all the food he needed so that he could continue to bless himself? No, you would say, well, here's typically what it would be. Say in the deep South when they had slaves, if a slave was trying to earn money, he might get a little bit of money at the end of the day. He might be able to take off just a little bit of a cut that the master would give him. The master wouldn't tell him, you get to keep 4/5 of it, and I'll take 1/5. It would be the other way around. And so he certainly doesn't do that whatsoever. And we have to ask the question, and again, Joseph has been charged by many people over the years of being a terrible tyrant in terms of what he did and not just giving them food out of compassion. And so here are some of the principles that we're going to learn. The first thing is, it wasn't just the Egyptians. Every single citizen of every kingdom was considered already a slave of the king. So when they say, make us, the servants of the king, they were already the servants of the king. They already would have to do whatever the Pharaoh would tell them to do. So frankly, Joseph didn't do anything for them that would have taken away their freedom whatsoever. And here are some of the moral principles that we could learn from what Joseph did. And this might be shocking to you. It probably doesn't, because you're all well-trained and good-thinking people. The first lesson that comes out of Genesis chapter 47 and verse 17 to the end, socialism is wrong. Strange thing to hear in the Bible. Socialism is wrong. There is no joint ownership of the land here, no joint ownership of the food. It's not like the people have a right to what Pharaoh has. If they believed in socialism, or socialism were the right thing to do, then Joseph would say, well, you break into the storehouses because it's yours. It's not yours. It's not theirs, is what he's telling them. But if you want some, you can buy some. So there's no joint ownership. People don't have a right to that which belongs to another person. You're seeing that all across the country today in more socialistic cities. People are feeling like they have a right to go into Walmart and take something because Walmart is rich and we're poor. You go into the jeweler and I've got this coming to me because of a socialist system. Absolutely, this passage teaches that is not the case. When you think about socialism as an ideology, socialism is an ideology that seeks to create a society where resources and wealth are distributed equally among its members, and the means of production are owned and controlled by the state or community. Had Joseph given them food, that would have been pure socialism. And Joseph doesn't do it. And so if he doesn't give them food, if it isn't theirs to take, then he's demonstrating that that's not God's plan. Remember this about Joseph, that Joseph is filled with the Spirit of God. And he's a wise man, and he's being directed by the Lord in all of his plans. And so, just think through that day for just a second. The people came to Joseph, and they want food, and the Spirit of God would have been working in Joseph's heart, and he would have thought, out of compassion for the people, I should just give them an allotment. But instead, the Lord didn't allow him to do that. In his wisdom, he said, no, you need to make them pay for what they're going to get. And that is so important. When you think about socialism, you think of places like Cuba, you think of North Korea, you think of Venezuela, you think of, hundreds of different places that people have tried socialism. Socialism always, 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 always fails. And here are some of the reasons that it fails. And again, I think this is important. This is something that we ought to stand on as a principle in terms of biblical truth. The reasons that socialism fails are simply these. Number one would be waste. So if Joseph gave them whatever they wanted, and they didn't have to pay for it, they might let there be holes in their bags. They might not take care of the animals very well. They might let the animals trample on the food. They might let their children waste it. Remember how we always had to eat what was on our plate? That wasn't necessarily a bad policy. Don't put so much on your plate, of course, but eat what is there. Socialism always leads to waste. It always leads to corruption, which is what it would have done. It always leads to greed. It always leads to a black market. By the way, I just sat down and I was just thinking through these and just reading what I could read and came up with it. It always leads with the inability of the market to adjust. It always leads to a lack of incentives, right? So if they give them this food, they have no incentive to work. They have no incentive to save. They have no incentive to be careful. It always leads to a stealing of work from the nobility or by the nobility. It leads to a stealing of the blessing of work. It is a disincentive to save, because if the government's going to give you food, you don't have to put money in the bank. Don't worry about retirement. It'll be just fine. It is a disincentive to good stewardship. It is a disincentive to investment, right? Why invest money if Joseph's going to give us food? It leads to the state control of commodities. It lowers production. You remember about the commonweal with the pilgrims? Fascinating account. The first year when the pilgrims came together, they established a commonweal, W-E-A-L, which is the same thing as commonwealth. What do you hear in the word commonwealth? It sounds like socialism. Commonwealth. That's what it means. In the first year when the pilgrims came together, they put all of their food in a joint storage area, and what they found at the end of the year is that they nearly starved to death, because there was no incentive for work, there was no incentive to save, there was no incentive to be careful, there was no incentive for anything. That's what happens in these systems. And so it leads to lower production, state control of ideas, state control of the population, and it leads to absolute authoritarianism. There are different kinds of socialism, by the way. This came from a couple of men. Let me give their names. This is just for fun. Robert Lawson and Benjamin Powell, two professors, decided that they would travel around the world and they would look at socialism in any place they could go and see how it worked. And they said in every place we went, it was always worse than you expected. And they said, here are the kinds of socialism that we found. There was starving socialism in Venezuela. There was subsistence socialism in Cuba, meaning they just barely got along. There was dark socialism in North Korea. There was fake socialism in China. And there was hungover socialism in Russia and in the Ukraine. In other words, everybody just got drunk, and that's the way that they dealt with their needs and problems. So what should we say about it? Well, the next lesson in this text is simply teaching us that personal property rights exist. The government doesn't have a right to take everything away from you. They can appropriately tax you, but it doesn't belong to them. See, that comes right out of the text. Also, the land, even though Joseph is going to give them opportunities, the land belongs to the people. They can sell it if they want. If they don't sell it, it is still theirs. The third lesson, and I've already said it, but I want to say it twice, is simply this: compassion can have no real basis for economic activity. Now, we want to be a compassionate people, and we want to find opportunities to help other people, but it's a terrible reason to make decisions. They had compassion on people, and they decided they felt so bad that they were in their mental institutions in California, and so they let them out. It really happened. The leftists came along and said, we need to be compassionate to people in mental institutions, so they opened the doors. And how compassionate was that? Out on the street they go, they suffer. Compassion on black families in the 50s and 60s, and the Great Society. What did that do? It destroyed the black family with all of their social programs. They wanted to have compassion on homeless people, and so they allow them to suffer, and they build their tent cities, and people are killed and maimed and murdered and raped and caught on fire. Terrible things. Compassion is no reason at all to make decisions on how you should help people. Now, Joseph's compassionate, but he's compassionate to them in this way. He knows that they need to be reminded to work. It is compassionate to require people to get out of bed. It's compassionate to require people to be good stewardship, to be good stewards and have good stewardship. And so here's what the Bible teaches. First one is simply this: New Testament, if you don't work, what don't you get to do? If you don't work, you don't get to eat. That's a biblical truth. That is a truth that Joseph was teaching these people. You see that? It goes all the way back there, from selling their money, using their money, using their cattle, using their land, and then fourthly, when they got seed that they could plant, if you don't work, you don't eat. Paul wasn't making up anything new. That comes, by the way, from 2 Thessalonians 3:10 through 12. The second thing that Joseph was teaching them, and that we can learn from this, is that we should work because work is ordained by God and something that God himself does. And I don't know if you've ever got out your concordance and looked up the word work and find out how many different times that it says God works. God works. And when we talk about the works of God, they're simply these. The works of God are creation, which he did in the past, and then preservation, which means the continuation of working to hold the universe together, and then providence. Those are the three works of God. Providence means that God is always using his hand to direct history. The fact that old Hitler was asleep in bed and no one was brave enough to wake him up for 12 hours, that was a work of God. That was providence working there along the way. One of the things that Jesus said about his Father is, by the way, if there was a favorite day for Christ to do a miracle, what day did he do his miracles? It's like he got out his calendar, it's Sabbath day. It's time to go do a good work. Jesus loved to do good works on the Sabbath day. And partly he was poking at the Pharisees who were crazy, right? You don't have their wrong system. But he would say it like this: if there was ever a day to do good, it was the Lord's day. And that's why he did good. And when Jesus is talking about doing good works on the Sabbath day, here's what he said. He said, my Father is working until now, and I'm going to work also. And so the principle of work, coming from Genesis chapter 37, is that God expects that we would be good stewards. The third principle in relation to work, in addition to if you don't work, you don't get to eat, 2 Thessalonians 3:10. Secondly, we should work because God is a worker. The third principle is that God provides for us unique talents and gifts so that we could work in our own ways. Best example is Bezalel. God gave to him the spirit of wisdom and the ability to design things, and he built the tabernacle. That was the gift of God. Every single one of us, you and myself, we have talents and gifts that God has given to us for the purpose of working in this world. That's part of the principle that is here. God provides for us unique talents and gifts so that we would work in special ways. When we work, principle number 4, we manifest godly character through our work. It's one of the ways that we are tested. When people are lazy and when they don't go to work, they are stealing against God or from God and from their employer. Proper work and good work is one of the things that gives us the opportunity to manifest godly character. And then lastly, and I'm going to give you two more principles, and we'll be done for the day. Our work allows us to serve and love other people. And so Joseph isn't going to take away their dignity. He's not going to take away their motivation. He's not going to take away their efforts. He's not going to take away, their opportunity to better themselves. And he's going to give them an opportunity to serve. Listen to what Paul said about it. Let him who stole steal no longer, right? So stop stealing. What would the motivation for stealing be? Because you want stuff. But rather let him labor, working with his hands what is good, that he may have something to give to him who is in need. I ought to work not just for myself. I ought to work so that I can have something to give to other people. That's a privilege and a responsibility of God. And I would say, last of all, I'm sure you know this, but it's wonderful to remember that the ability to work and the privilege of working and the opportunity to work is just simply a gift of God that enriches our lives in lots of ways. You know, they have said, I haven't read this recently, but I have heard it in the past, that the most dangerous year in the life of a man is year 65. And the reason that year 65 is the most dangerous year in his life is that's the year that typically a man would retire, and when he loses that drive and that opportunity and that privilege of working, he basically forgets who he is. He loses purpose in life. And so work is one of the blessings that God gives to us to make us better, even if we don't want to be. That's really what it is. Even if I don't want to be better, even if I'd rather stay in bed and like a hinge on a door, what's Proverbs say? You know, like a hinge on a door, so is a lazy man in his bed. It just turns back and forth. I could do that. You could do that. But God has given us this opportunity and responsibility and requirement that we would work for the things we have because he knows that it's the best for us. If you take a horse and you leave that horse in a stall and never ride it, you never work it, you always leave it there, what happens to it? It doesn't get better. It just gets worse, and so do we. And so, looking at the principle of Joseph, just finishing it with two sentences, Joseph didn't give them food. He made them buy it because he was truly compassionate on them. So go ahead, Gary, please.
Socialism results in a dull, lazy people with no vision.
No vision. Yeah, they turn into zombies. Absolutely, yeah. Socialism has been around since the time of Plato. He was one of the first ones who kind of described it and developed it. Communism is socialism with guns. You know, it's a more violent form. But socialism, its main goal is always to destroy everything it touches. And Joseph didn't want to destroy the people, the Egyptians. He saved them. And again, it would have been tempting just to be compassionate and just open the storehouses and give them food. But I guess I'd say it like this. He was too compassionate and too loving to give them what they desired. He gave them what they needed. So, great. Tell your grandchildren, right? They're the ones who need to know it. I know you don't need to know it. You've got it all figured out. But the Bible has a lot more to say about economic theory than maybe we would understand. And if nothing else, you could say, Joseph didn't give anything away for free to the Egyptians. We shouldn't be doing it either. So, biblical truth that I think is important. Let's pray together and we'll be done. Thank you, Lord, for an opportunity to talk on a subject that I really do think is relevant for our land and our country, as we're seeing a whole generation of people who have no knowledge and understanding of personal property and property rights and the need to have incentives to work and to invest and to save and to give. It all comes from the fact that you've given us the ordinance of work, and it started in the Garden of Eden. That you placed them, Adam and Eve, in the garden to work and to tend the garden because you knew that's where their best happiness and motivations for a good life would come from. Lord, remind us of that. Give us opportunities to be faithful in all that we do. And we just thank you for the wisdom of Joseph as we stand back and marvel at how he directed a great time of a severe famine and blessed even the Egyptians for the glory of God. Thank you now. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.